The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night, bouncing off the rearview mirror of the sleek black sedan. A sigh escaped from the woman behind the wheel as she slowly pulled over to the side of the road. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know the routine, but tonight, things were about to take an unexpected turn. Two officers stepped out of their patrol car, their boots crunching against the pavement as they approached. One on each side. Their hands rested near their belts, their expressions unreadable in the dim glow of the streetlights. "License and registration," the taller one demanded, his voice firm. The woman kept her hands visible, moving deliberately as she reached for her purse. She knew the rules. She had taught them herself. But something in the air felt tense, off. Maybe it was the way the second officer's fingers tightened around his flashlight, or maybe it was just one of those nights. As she handed over her ID, she watched the officer's face closely. His eyes scanned the card, his brow furrowing for a split second before he masked his reaction. He glanced at his partner, as if trying to decide something without speaking. The silence stretched. "Ma'am, do you know why we pulled you over?" She tilted her head slightly, studying them. "I'm sure you're about to tell me." Her voice was calm but carried an edge, one only someone who had spent years in law enforcement could master. The officers exchanged another look. The tension in the air was almost tangible. They had no idea who they had just pulled over. Not yet. And in just a few moments, their entire night, and possibly their careers, would take a turn they never saw coming. The officer holding her ID shifted his weight, glancing at the name again. Something about it felt familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. His partner, still standing near the passenger side, kept his eyes locked on her, waiting for any sign of trouble. "We clocked you a few miles over the limit," the officer finally said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "A few miles over, huh?" she repeated, almost like she was testing the words. The second officer stepped closer, his flashlight still trained on her hands. "Where are you headed this late?" he asked, his tone edged with curiosity, maybe even suspicion. She exhaled softly, her fingers tapping against the steering wheel. "Just finishing up a long day," she said. "And you?" Neither officer answered right away. There was something about her, the way she held herself, the way she spoke. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't even annoyed. She was just waiting. The taller officer glanced back at her ID, then his partner. "Stay here," he muttered, stepping toward the patrol car. The second officer didn't move, his stance still firm. Inside the squad car, the officer pulled up their system and typed in the name from the license. The moment the results popped up, his stomach dropped. His eyes darted from the screen back to the woman sitting calmly in her car. He swallowed hard. This couldn't be right. His hands hovered over the keyboard, as if typing it again would somehow change what he was seeing. But the information was clear. Newly appointed, highly decorated, their new boss. His breath hitched as reality set in. They had just pulled over the new chief of police. His partner was still standing there, completely unaware. The officer hesitated for a second, debating whether to call him over or just get back out there. Either way, this wasn't going to end the way they thought. And from the way she sat waiting, her expression cool and patient, she knew it too. The officer in the patrol car exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the laptop as his mind raced. There was no mistaking it. The woman sitting calmly in her car, waiting, was not just another driver. She was their superior, their new chief of police, and they had just pulled her over like she was anyone else. His partner, still unaware, shifted his stance near the driver's side. The silence stretched between them. The woman hadn't asked any more questions. She hadn't flashed her badge or demanded special treatment. She was just watching, waiting. The officer in the car debated his next move. If he told his partner now, things could get messy. His partner wasn't the type to take surprises well, and the way this night was unfolding, surprises were the last thing either of them needed. Steeling himself, he pushed the door open and walked back toward the scene. The cool night air did nothing to steady his nerves. He leaned in close to his partner, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk. Now." His partner frowned, glancing at him before stealing another quick look at the woman behind the wheel. "What?" he muttered, clearly impatient. "We're in the middle of something." The first officer shook his head slightly. "No, we're not." He hesitated, then took a breath. "That's the new chief of police." The words hung in the air for a long second. The other officer blinked. His grip on the flashlight tightened. "What?" "I ran her ID. It's her." The flashlight dipped slightly. His jaw clenched. He turned back to the woman in the car, his expression shifting. She hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, but there was something about her gaze, steady, knowing. The officer swallowed hard. "Does she know we know?" "I think she knew before we even got out of the car." Another beat of silence. Then the second officer straightened his shoulders, adjusting his belt like he was bracing himself. "So what do we do?" His partner exhaled. "That's the question, isn't it?" And still, the chief waited, unshaken, unmoved, as if she already knew exactly how this was going to play out. The second officer's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Everything about this situation had just changed, and now every move they made mattered. His partner took a step back, rubbing a hand over his chin, his mind clearly racing. "We can't just stand here," he muttered. "She's waiting for us to do something." The chief still hadn't moved. She sat there, patient, unreadable. There was no anger in her face, no fear, just quiet control. She wasn't going to make this easy for them. The second officer cleared his throat, forcing himself to stay steady as he took a slow step toward the driver's side. He felt the heat of his partner's stare, but he couldn't hesitate now. The longer they dragged this out, the worse it would look. He bent down slightly, meeting the chief's gaze. "Ma'am," he started, but his voice sounded different now, careful, unsure. "We ran your ID." She lifted a brow, but didn't speak. He felt his throat tighten. She wasn't going to help him out of this. We didn't realize who you were." His words tumbled out awkwardly. He wasn't used to feeling like this. Caught off guard, exposed. The chief studied him for a long moment, then finally leaned forward, resting her arms on the steering wheel. "And if I weren't me," she asked, her voice calm but sharp, "what would have happened?" The officer hesitated. His mind flicked back over the last few minutes, the way they had approached, the way they had spoken to her. Nothing had been out of line, not exactly, but the tension in his chest told him that wasn't the point. His partner took a step forward, stiff. "Chief, we." She held up a hand, silencing him. Her gaze flicked between the two of them, measuring, waiting. "Answer the question." The air between them felt thick, charged. The officers exchanged a quick glance. There was no easy way out of this, no smooth way to move past it. And in that moment, they realized the real test hadn't started yet. The silence stretched, heavy and unshakable. The chief's question still hung in the air, unanswered. The officers shifted uneasily, realizing that nothing they said would come out right. Then the radio crackled to life. "All units, report of a possible armed suspect near Oakwood and 7th. Description matches." The dispatcher's voice cut through the tension, sharp and urgent. Both officers instinctively reached for their radios, but before they could respond, the chief spoke. "I'll take it." The officers froze. The chief calmly reached for the door handle. The moment she moved, both men instinctively stepped back, their training kicking in, but she didn't seem bothered. She pushed the door open and stood, her presence commanding even in the dim glow of the streetlights. "Chief," the first officer started, unsure whether to stop her or step aside. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve and looked at them evenly. "You both just pulled me over," she said, her voice level. "Do you believe I'm unfit to respond?" Neither officer had an answer. Then, Another voice cut through the night. "You won't make it there in time." All three turned toward the sound. A man stood on the sidewalk a few feet away, partially hidden in the shadows, hands in his pockets, watching. The officers immediately tensed, hands inching toward their holsters. The chief didn't move. "And why's that?" she asked, her tone unreadable. The man took a slow step forward, his face coming into view. He was in plain clothes, but there was something about him, his posture, the way he spoke, that sent a ripple of unease through the air. "Because," he said, glancing toward the officers with a knowing smirk, "you're already a distraction." The words sent a chill down their spines. The officers exchanged a look. Something about this didn't feel right. The chief remained still, her eyes locked onto the man. "And you would know that how?" The man's smirk widened, and that's when the first officer noticed it, the faint glint of something metallic peeking out from the man's jacket. The first officer's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered near his holster, instincts screaming at him. The man in front of them wasn't just some bystander. He was here for a reason. The chief, however, didn't flinch. She took a slow step forward, her gaze locked on the man. "You've been watching us," she said evenly. "Why?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "Because you're all looking the wrong way." Before the words had fully registered, a sharp sound cut through the night. A car door slamming down the street. The second officer turned his head just for a second, but that was all it took. The man moved. His hand shot toward his jacket. The first officer's instincts took over. "Gun," he shouted, drawing his weapon. The second officer reacted a half-second later, stepping into a defensive stance, his heart pounding. But the chief, she was faster. Before the man could pull whatever he had, she was on him. In one fluid motion, she grabbed his wrist, twisted sharply, and forced him off balance. He stumbled, cursing, as something clattered to the pavement, a badge. Both officers froze. The man groaned, shaking his arm out as he glared up at the chief. "Dan," he muttered, "I thought you were supposed to be the calm and collected type." She released him, stepping back. "And I thought you were supposed to introduce yourself before staging an ambush." The officers stood in stunned silence as the man dusted himself off, shaking his head with a smirk. "Detective Harris, Internal Affairs," he sighed, rubbing his wrist. "You two really need to work on your reaction times." The chief crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And you need to work on your approach." The first officer's mind was still spinning. Internal Affairs? He looked down at the discarded badge, then back at the chief, his pulse still racing. "You knew?" he asked hesitantly. The chief glanced at him. "Let's just say I had a feeling." Detective Harris chuckled. "Not bad, Chief. Not bad at all." The radio crackled again, breaking the tension. The real call for backup was still out there. The night wasn't over yet. The chief gave the two officers a long look. "You coming or not?" Without hesitation, they followed her. The two officers moved without thinking, falling in step behind the chief as she strode toward her car. The tension from moments ago still clung to the air, but something had shifted. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were following her. Detective Harris chuckled as he dusted himself off, watching them with an amused glint in his eye. "Well, this has been fun," he muttered, slipping his badge back into his jacket. "Consider it a lesson. You never know who's watching." The chief shot him a sharp look. "And next time, try teaching without nearly getting tackled." Harris smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" The officers barely heard him. Their minds were still racing, replaying everything that had happened. The traffic stop, the realization, the test they hadn't even known they were taking. The second officer cleared his throat. "Chief," he hesitated, unsure of how to say what he was thinking. "Back there, when you asked what would have happened if you weren't you, were you testing us too?" The chief paused, her hand on the car door. She turned to look at them, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then finally she gave a small nod. Every day is a test for all of us. The weight of her words settled in. It wasn't just about the stop. It was about the job, the responsibility, the choices they made, whether they realized they were being watched or not. The radio crackled again, urgent. The real calls still needed their response. The chief got into her car, but before she pulled off, she gave them one last look. "See you out there." With that, she was gone, taillights disappearing into the night. The two officers stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. Then, without another word, they hurried back to their squad car, flipping on the lights and sirens as they sped off into the city. Tonight had been a lesson, and they wouldn't forget it.